$150 million was the amount the Biden administration has just announced to boost ties with a group of 10 Asia-Pacific countries. The first in-person engagement in 5 years between leaders of U.S. and ASEAN wrapped up in Washington on Friday. Why the frugality against the aid bill passed by the House for Ukraine, which is over 260 times more? Why did President Biden not have bilateral meetings with ASEAN leaders? And where does the meeting fit in the United States' overall Indo-Pacific strategy? Let's look at all these issues with Professor Peter Kuznit, Director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at the American University, joining me from Washington, D.C. Dr. A. Sung Oh, Principal Advisor of the Pacific Research Center from Malaysia, joining me from Sabah, Malaysia, and from Beijing, Rong Ying, Vice President of the China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. Peter, let me go to you. As I mentioned in the lead-in, $150 million for 10 countries in ASEAN with a population of 660 million people. That's not a lot. Why not more?
The United States' focus for the last few months has not been on Asia. It's been on Ukraine. The United States just pledged $40 billion additional to support the Ukrainian military in its war against Russia. Asia has been lost in this process, but the neglect of Asia actually goes back further, especially of Southeast Asia. It was largely neglected for the 4 years of the Trump administration. Biden finally appointed an ambassador to ASEAN. Trump never even had an ambassador. The Biden administration has focused much more. We've had visits to Southeast Asia by Harris, Blinken, Raimondo, Austin, a virtual summit in October, and now this meeting here in Washington. But there has not been a lot of attention paid, because even though Biden came to office saying that his main focus was going to be on combating China, because of what's happened in the world between the pandemic and the invasion of Ukraine, the United States has been focused on that region. So Biden is trying to show that he can still deal with Asia also, but he's doing it in his framework. He wants to rally the Southeast Asian countries to support the U.S. Against Russia and Ukraine and against China. And that's not the framework that anybody wants to have. The only country of the ASEAN countries that's supporting U.S. sanctions against Russia is Singapore. And so he's not getting support. That framework, this democracy versus autocracy framework that Biden has been touting, is not going to play with these countries. They want something very, very different. They want trade, they want economic development.
Right. We've heard some comments from countries in the region, especially from Cambodia, which hosts the rotating ASEAN presidency this year. Kao Kim Hoon, who is a minister and close advisor to Cambodia's Prime Minister Hun Sen, said before the summit that as a big country, a host country, the United States should be more generous to the guests, the leaders who are traveling to Washington, particularly as Biden is going to be talking about elevating the strategic partnership to a comprehensive strategic partnership. We also noted that there has been no one-on-one meeting between President Biden and these ASEAN leaders who are making this trip there. Cambodian Prime Minister Hun Sen actually even got a shoe thrown at him during his time in Washington, in the United States. So, Dr. O, how is all of this being perceived in ASEAN countries?
Well, ASEAN countries, as was said, very much looking forward to more trade with the United States and more investment coming from the United States. Unfortunately, I think the United States systemically would not have that capacity, because it does not have a lot of state-owned enterprises, and therefore is not in a position to really rally or mobilize its national resources to focus them, for example, into Southeast Asia. It simply does not have that kind of systemic ability. Number two, in a sense, I think the US is sort of taking the ASEAN countries for granted, because, well, there are not a lot of wars in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asian countries in general have been doing quite well. Vietnam, for example, in recent years, doing quite well in attracting some American investments. So the United States, I think, does not think that this part of the region would require that kind of massive amount of aid or assistance as, for example, in the U.S. opinions, Ukraine would require. Yeah.
Mr. Rong, what is your understanding of the situation? Is that why the 10 countries in ASEAN is getting a fraction of what Ukraine is getting, despite if you compare the total population and importance in terms of economy? Is ASEAN a priority for the United States?
Yeah, I think as far as I can see, ASEAN countries with regard to US, is certainly, I think, investment, grant, loans are being important. 150 100 million is not much compared to the US, the other commitment down to other areas. But I think what the ASEAN would like to have most is, of course, a consistent commitment that not only goes beyond the rhetoric, and more importantly, as I can see, the region as a whole would like the United States to play a constructive role in terms of upholding the principles and the norms that has been help the region as a whole to achieve long-term peace and development. For example, for ASEAN, the most important thing is this ASEAN centrality. And the other important thing, I think, as far as the regional country is concerned, is that the kind of open and inclusive sort of approach that the region would like to have, instead of a kind of bloc politics, instead of
do you think, Professor Rong, do you think the ASEAN countries are getting these signals, are getting what they are looking for from the meeting that just concluded?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I think rhetorically we have seen the statements, the speeches. I think the United States seems that they have learned the lessons, or they are making their best to be fair. But in reality, I think the question remains that whether this kind of commitment were consistent. Because if you look at the rhetoric, look at the statements, the so-called rebalance to the Asia, the pivot to Asia, the whatever this is, that was more than 10 years ago. And because of the priorities of the United States, that's not being implemented in such a way. And even for this administration, I think this event, this special meeting, as far as I can see, is framed as one of the effort, part of the event that for United States Asia policy, because we all know that President Biden is visiting the region, South Korea, Japan, and then others.
Yeah, we'll get to that in just a moment. I want to focus on Ukraine because in the joint vision statement released after the meeting, there is a paragraph mentioning Ukraine, and very interestingly, it did not use words such as condemnation or invasion. It said cessation of hostilities. Peter, it seems that the United States has really been, catering to the kind of stance of the ASEAN in terms of this issue. Would you say that this would have been the U.S. preferred outcome, or they made a compromise taking ASEAN's position into consideration?
The U.S. didn't have much of a choice in this one. The ASEAN countries made it clear before they got here that they were not going to sign on to an anti-Russian statement. Even though that would have been Biden's hope and his wish, and he tried to nudge them in that direction, there was no interest in doing that. These countries do not want to make a choice. They want to have friendly relations with China, they want to have friendly relations with Russia, and they want to have friendly relations with the United States. That's going to allow for an environment in which they can continue to grow and to prosper. But the United States is trying to create this polarized world right now. And it thinks it's doing it from a position of strength because Russia has been weakened by this invasion of Ukraine. So the US is pushing for a defeat of Russia, even though that's very dangerous, even though this war can expand, even though there's a threat increasingly raised of even the use of nuclear weapons. So it's a dangerous game, I'm afraid. But these countries do not want to be part of that.
All right. The United States keep talking about Indo-Pacific, and we know that this term has a very deep geopolitical and security connotation to it. But it seems that leaders from ASEAN are reluctant. They're very careful when they have to use this term. Dr. Oh, help us understand the ASEAN approach towards the Indo-Pacific strategy idea that the United States is trying to sell or promote, even when they talk about, for instance, when they talk about vaccine, instead of using any other framework, they use the Quad framework, which is also a very heavily security-laden word. Dr. Oh, how do ASEAN countries look at terms such as Indo-Pacific and Quad?
Well, a lot of ASEAN countries have traditional defense and security ties with the United States. For example, the Philippines and Singapore will be examples. And I think at the beginning, when President Trump introduced the Indo-Pacific strategy, ASEAN countries did put up a so-called outlook on the Indo-Pacific area and so on. So there was some shall we say, baby steps or gingerly steps towards understanding what is Indo-Pacific. But when the US, I think it's pivoting more towards the security aspect of Indo-Pacific, but shall we say, not put up the resources for that assertion. I think a lot of ASEAN countries are paying at best lukewarm attention to this so-called Indo-Pacific strategy. Yeah.
Okay. Finally, I want to mention this point. There's a paragraph, and Mr. Rong, I have your insight if I can. The joint statement does mention the importance of the declaration on the conduct of parties in the South China Sea, and it says it wants to maintain and promote an environment conducive to the code of conduct in the South China Sea negotiations. That seems to be a constructive message.
The role United States would be sort of welcomed if it is sincere, out of sincerity, to support the process. As we know that China and ASEAN has working on this COC, the Code of Conduct, for quite a long time. And the obstacles or the perceived problems so far is, I think, the concern is that the external force interference are there. And the United States, if they are sincere about that, it should come out clear and loud for support these efforts that China and ASEAN are going on, so that for the peaceful settlement and management of this crisis, this issue.
We have to leave it there. Many thanks to all my guests, Peter Kuznick, Dr. Asung Oh, and Rong Ying, joining us from different parts of the world. And with that, we come to the end of this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle Liu Xin in Beijing. On behalf of the whole team, thanks for watching. You've got The Point.